Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome back to the podcast today Jake Werner. Jake is the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a historian by training, so I always enjoy having Jake on. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, great to be back.
So Jake, you sent me a piece that's in draft, but I really want to talk about it, which is basically tracing one of the largest transformations in the history of American thinking about the world in the last 10 or so years, which is the transformation of China from a country that the United States was trying to embed in the neoliberal capitalist world order, a country through which that the United States understood to be competing with and maybe didn't like everything that it did, particularly cyber espionage. I sound like a 90s movie person, cyber. I feel like that's such an old term, but people still use it in this particular sphere. But into something that both parties have embraced as effectively an existential enemy of the United States, akin to how American policymakers on both sides of the aisle viewed the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War between roughly the late 1940s and the Cuban Missile Crisis or signing of the Test Ban Treaty, whichever period you want to choose, whichever date you want to choose, in the early 1960s, 1962, 1963. So China viewed as really an ideological enemy. And this to me is really interesting. And then I'll stop my soliloquy because I recently published a piece on the new multipolarity. And one of the major arguments I made in this piece that came out in the ideas letter called Power Without Ideology, Welcome to the Multipolar World, was that one of the key features of international relations, or the new international order that is emerging in the 21st century, is that it's not going to be defined by the great powers or the superpowers trying to export a universalist political, economic, ideological project that they think that other countries would adopt. This being a departure, I argue, from basically the last 2 centuries of history. So I think these pieces complement each other nicely. So why don't we start with yours and talking about what happened? How did the United States view China in the post-Cold War period? And how did this transform in the last decade or so?
Yeah, so already from the 90s, the post-Cold War period begins with 1989, of course. And China was part of 1989 was the sort of the period 1989 to 1991 is a period of popular uprisings against state power around the world. The place that China shows up in this is the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre. So that threw a wrench into the already strong collaboration between the U.S. and China, which had been focused up to that point on containing the power of the Soviet Union. George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time, he immediately tried to restore that relationship, and he sent his advisors secretly at first, and then openly to try to paper over the problem of this mass murder by Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese regime. But fairly quickly then, because the business community saw lots of opportunities in reforming and opening up China, both parties came on board the idea that we're going to engage with China diplomatically, we're going to deepen ties economically. And when Bill Clinton came in, at first he was on he ran on a human rights platform around China, but he repudiated that shortly afterwards. And the consensus starting from the mid 90s until China was brought into the WTO was we want to integrate China into this system. We don't want to contain it or confront it. We want to integrate it into the neoliberal globalization system.
So Jake, one question that I have about this is, to what degree do you think that this was part of an effort to discipline labor? I know that's not what you focus on professionally, but I know it's something that you're interested in because the so-called China shock. And so there's part of this effort to embed China in this neoliberal capitalist order will involve the offshoring of jobs, not in every sector. And it's not solely responsible for deindustrialization. Automation is a huge factor there. But what do you say to the populist argument. Now, what do you say? Like, is this an accurate understanding of what happens? That's something that capital wants to discipline labor partially by having China embedded in the world capitalist order as a means to offshore labor from an already deindustrializing United States.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but maybe not at that level of intentionality. Because the pattern of offshoring manufacturing jobs in the United States was already well established by this point. It started already in the 70s and was really major deindustrialization from the 80s to the 90s. It really wasn't until
In the Pacific Northwest, just very interesting. It starts in the 60s. The timber industry starts to be offshored like 10 years before like what becomes the Rust Belt. It's pretty interesting.
yeah, and well, you have the same internal dynamic, like the kind of the core industrial areas of the industrial Midwest, the northern states, were already moving production to the South to get away from the power of labor in the 60s. So but then obviously it became international in scale once it became possible, once like global production networks became possible, really starting in the 70s. And like I think a lot of the populist backlash against this, people still think about NAFTA as the ultimate betrayal. I think a lot of people in DC focus on the China shock, which was this period after China entered the WTO in 2001. So the sort of the decade of the aughts up to, or at least up to the financial crisis of 2008. That's kind of the core period of the China shock, and that's when thousands upon thousands of jobs were moved to China, and this is true.
And I encourage people to read like the Clinton speech about China's accession to the WTO. It's like the height of neoliberal ideology.
Totally.
Like
Yes.
I usually don't get that far in my classes, but like that is to me the best, just one single document on like neoliberal brainworms. It is
Yes.
wild. I'm sure Jake, you have read it a million times.
Oh yeah. It's a great primary text. If you're teaching this stuff, like look for that as primary text for your students, definitely. But I think the interesting thing is that there was all these American jobs were lost to Chinese production, but people don't remember that quite as strongly as NAFTA, because many of those jobs were already pretty shitty jobs. Like that internal movement from the unionized North to the non-union South had already happened, and a lot of the job loss was in the non-union South. And there weren't that many people lamenting those jobs. Now, it did devastate many communities, and that had really important political effects. But the sense that we have lost the golden age of union labor and an income that can support a family, that was already gone by the time China came into the picture. So I think there's a conflation in Washington. Like, we want to confront China geopolitically, and wouldn't it be great if we could get working class support for that? So then there's a lot of focus on the China shock and very little focus on how an earlier rounds of offshoring to Mexico or Central America to Turkey or Southeast Asia, those earlier rounds kind of disappear from the picture then.
How does this become dogma before we move on from this 20-year-ish period, 19-year period between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the financial crisis of 07-08? How does this become dogma in both parties? And I'm sure this story, I mean, maybe it won't be, because I don't think there's going to be many future historians, but if there were future historians, they would complicate this. But how does this become dogma in both political parties? That the goal of the United States is to essentially create a neoliberal capitalist world order, with the United States standing at the head of a pyramidal structure in which it basically is the ultimate consumer, and other parts of the world produce.
Right. So it is complicated because it doesn't take over the entire Democratic Party. If you look at free trade votes, for example, throughout this period, most Democrats in Congress are voting against free trade agreements. So and that's because they're responsive to unionized labor, to the states that are threatened by offshoring. But at the level of the presidential leadership, and often at the level of congressional leadership, particularly as we get to the end of this period. Yes, it's just like the common sense. Like, this is just what we do. This is, these people are reading Thomas Friedman, and they're like, yes, an open world where everyone can succeed as long as they have talent and everyone can get access to the tools they need to succeed, like cell phones or whatever. I don't know where capital comes in to their conceptualization here, but like everyone has a cell phone now, so anyone can be an entrepreneur. Like you get these kinds of uh, fantasies of perfect entrepreneurialism that encompass everyone in the world, everyone from a rich man in San Francisco to a poor man in Nigeria or something. And that is obviously that's in service to economic interests. Corporations want to expand their footprint. They want to be able to sell into global markets. They want to be able to exploit a global labor pool. But I think it's worth saying it's also more than that. There were attractive ideals about neoliberalism. Like we could have an open world that was cosmopolitan. We could have access to other cultures. We could talk with other people. We didn't have to have great power wars. We didn't have to fear geopolitical strife. We could have like the commercial peace. Like that ideal was very attractive to a lot of people, and not just at the elite level. Now, it could never make good on its promises, and that ultimately became a problem for the system as it lost legitimacy. But I think we should recognize that those ideals were very attractive, and they continue even to this day. They continue to wield a lot of attraction in like every time Trump comes into office, right? Democrats are like, no, actually, we love immigration, we love free trade, and some of that's just in reaction to Trump, but some of that is there is a desire for an open world that is at peace and where different countries can get along and exchange with each other, exchange at the level of commerce, but also exchange at the level of ideas and culture.
I just wanted to jump in here and remind everybody, or maybe you're not aware of this, that no two countries with a McDonald's have ever, gone to war with each other.
Until 2008, right? Was it Russia and Georgia? That was the first McDonald's war?
Yeah. It was definitely Russia and somebody, whether it was Georgia or Ukraine, depending on how you pick that apart. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Russia and Georgia is the first McDonald's war, as I call it in my brain.
And of course, Russia doesn't have McDonald's now. They have like the Russian version of McDowell's, which is, they took over the McDonald's spaces.
That's a Coming to America reference, kids. If you haven't seen it, check it out. The kids love that movie. Arsenio Hall, a very funny guy. And obviously Eddie Murphy.
He was very good in that movie.
He was great in that movie.
So what happens? Like what happens to change this outlook that we're going to have this perfect neoliberal world and everybody's going to get along?
Well, and also I just want to underline before we get into the next stage, like Jake, you make a really interesting point in your essay about this notion of abstract equality. And I think that's really, really key and probably one of the reasons that identity politics exploded like it did in the 2010s is a sort of response. I just want to underline this and then we can get to Derek's thing. Because of this notion that we are now all existing on a playing field where race and gender and nationality and capital don't matter anymore because you've got your cell phone. And I think that that's actually a really key point that I haven't seen like many people make. And I think it's only a minor point in your essay, but that might be worth drawing out. Like neoliberalism is abstract by definition. And in that sense, it really represents, to my mind, the apotheosis of a type of liberal thinking that took off in the 20th century of like this equal playing field, negative liberty, freedom from things. So I just want to underline that because I thought that was quite a good point.
Yeah, and I think this is also really important for understanding the nature of the crisis that we're living right now, because people have, at least on the reactionary side, have turned against that idea of abstraction and are attacking it directly. And what I'm talking about here is just the sense of abstract equality. People on the left, I think, can very easily see that free market society is driven at every level by concrete inequalities, and that people's life chances and even their thinking is shaped by where they're at on the class hierarchy and what kinds of actual experience of domination they have, what kinds of racial inequalities there are, the different ways that gender are treated. But there's another side to that, which is that markets in principle treat everyone the same. They're not based on a caste system. They're not based on the idea that people have to stay in their place. Quite the opposite. They're based on the idea that people can move, that they must be able to move, because that's the only way that we can have markets that work properly. And that means move socially. It means move geographically. It means move across the course of their lives. And it also means the ability to reshape who they are. So there isn't a sense of fixed identity, like fixed racial or civilizational or national identity. These things are fluid and they're open to reinvention and they're decided by the individual, right? These are the sort of orienting ideological assumptions behind neoliberalism, but they come from somewhere. There's a reason they become plausible. And that's because when you live in a market-dominated society, that is how people appear, until you look at their concrete conditions. And I think we have to hold those. This is a contradiction. It's not that one is true and the other is false. It's that this is a contradiction. People actually are constituted as abstractly equal, and they are constituted as concretely unequal. And that basically sets up the debate between leftists and liberals, both on the liberals and the right-wing liberals that the Democratic and Republican parties used to be before the Republicans became reactionaries rather than liberals.
And that's a really crucial point. And that gets into really interesting historical questions of why certain minority groups have tended to really be supportive of capitalism, because it's a way to basically get beyond placed identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity. And that is, I think, a process going back a very, very long time.
And this is also kind of the grounds on which people who criticize actually existing neoliberalism often stand on, is they say, look, it's not realizing its ideal. It claims that everyone's going to be abstractly equal, and we can see that that's not the case. So what we need to do is this, this, and this, and that will make everyone abstractly equal. And it's not possible. You can't have everyone abstractly equal. So that ideal is not realizable in practice. But because that ideal is systematically generated, people are like, this is something I can stand on and I can criticize the outcomes of the system, if not the system itself.
Right. Then that's, folks, what we call imminent critique, criticizing the system for not realizing its own ideals. If you ever come across that term when you're reading Marxist theory, that is the criticism. But Jake, I do think it's important to return to Derek's question, which is what happens? How does 2008 reshape all of this, at least in the long term? Because there's some interesting initial reactions to the global financial crisis.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that the tensions are there and building up. And ultimately, the crisis is a result of these tensions within the system of global neoliberalism being unmanageable. The core driver of the financial crisis was there weren't enough consumers to purchase the output of the system, and those consumers had to be created then through unsustainable growth in consumer debt and also government debt, more in Europe than in the United States. And through unsustainable speculative bubbles. So it was the creation of those speculative bubbles that drove Wall Street. It was the creation of those debt bubbles that sustained consumer demand in the system, and that all fell off a cliff in 2008. So that's one of these tensions, but there's many more, much wider range of sort of social tensions that are building up in this period. And you see this particularly acutely in China, actually. China, which I would argue is completely neoliberal, is completely internal to the system of global neoliberalism. You see in the years immediately preceding 2008, including 2008, there's all these scandals about companies like selling poisoned milk. Basically, it's not poison, but they're using cheaper inputs that mimic the properties of infant formula, and then selling it to infants, and then the infants die. So there were dozens of babies died, and many others were made terribly sick by this infant formula. And it's those kinds of like fraudulent or degraded products. Those kinds of scandals are all over the place. There's all kinds of scandals about local officials who are abusing their position, who are ripping people off, who are taking their land and selling it to developers. There's scandals about like the developers themselves evicting, like hiring thugs to evict people from their homes. There's scandals about like construction contractors who are not paying their wages. So you see this in a really extreme form in China, but you see these kinds of tensions building up. People are increasingly resentful of the inequalities and the forms of everyday insecurity they experience in neoliberal society all around the world. But it really took the 2008 crisis to bring that into the open, and for people to start questioning the system itself rather than just being like, well, it's like this corrupt local official. That's the problem. You get rid of this guy and then things will be okay. It became much harder after 2008 when the global economy was no longer growing quickly, because the driver of demand in increasingly indebted rich countries had been removed. Now there were other new speculative bubbles to make up for that. Gigantic speculative bubble in property in China, the big, what eventually proved to be a bubble in the fracking industry in the United States. So you got, and then just like, I don't know if you can remember the like Uber, but for dog walking, that like got $1 billion fundraising round. Like there's all these like speculative bubbles in the tech industry too.
Well, not only that, I mean, I think the Uber for dog walking is a interesting thing because you essentially have just the turn to total monopoly play, right? Like the only strategy that exists in a world of deregulated capitalism where monopolization and financialization go together is like all of those companies are essentially going to become the Uber for dog walking. What that means is that they will control the dog walking business. And I think that's interesting because that is like a very particular stage of capitalism where there essentially is capitalism without competition. The competition is basically to get enough fundraising dollars to operate at a loss for X amount of time until you destroy every other business. And then you're just able to raise prices to whatever degree you want, as Uber has done and DoorDash has done, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to point that out. And then I think it's really, I think listeners are probably aware of, Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring as responses to 2008, but probably less aware of what actually happens in China, because there is a populist response in China that you talk about. And could we go into like what happens there and how the party and eventually Xi responds to it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's all of these tensions in Chinese society about the abuses and inequalities that people are suffering on a massive scale. And there's one party secretary of Chongqing, who emerges and starts to try to mobilize these passions into a politics so he can make a play to get on the standing committee of the Communist Party and maybe even become the next president. This is, there's contention around this. So eventually Xi Jinping comes in 2012. But in the years leading up to that, this man, Bo Xilai, is jockeying for power in a very unorthodox way within the party. Right in the party, it's usually all of this is behind closed doors. All of this is around factional negotiations and factional struggles. And he's out there publicly mobilizing all of this anti-elite resentment. He's attacking rich people. He's attacking the like organized crime that has prospered in under neoliberal conditions, of course. He's encouraging people to come together and sing red songs. These are songs from the Cultural Revolution that like celebrate egalitarianism and denounce the like unjust leaders of the people. And the rest of the party leadership is looking at this and being like, this is crazy, man. He's trying to take us back to the Cultural Revolution when Mao mobilized the entire population against the state, against the leaders of the state, and overthrew many of them. And so they're terrified by what he's doing. But at the same time, they're like, well, but he's also tapping into something that's there that we need to worry about, because they see all these scandals. They see the way that the party is losing legitimacy. They see the way that party cadres themselves are just, the corruption is everywhere. And it's like the party center can't control these people anymore. They have their own kind of like local networks, and like party leaders at a local level are hooked in with organized crime. They are hooked in with the rich businessmen in the region. And the party center is thinking, can we control them? Are they going to induce a popular uprising without the leadership of Bo Xilai? And in the years leading up to this, there was massive protest activity in China, much more protest activity in China than in the United States. So it was really fragmented, and it tended to happen at a local level, like targeting a local employer, targeting a local cadre. It wasn't like a national movement, because the party made sure that it didn't become a national movement by controlling the media and through selective repression. But the party leadership was aware that there was massive protests across the country in the aughts, and they were trying to respond to it by building out labor arbitration systems, by building out basic welfare provisions that had been totally dismantled in the previous decade. And now when Xi Jinping finally comes in, so Bo Xilai himself, he gets himself overthrown in a very weird scandal where his wife is accused of murdering a British businessman, and apparently did so. It doesn't appear to be a frame up. His sort of local chief of police that had been involved in a lot of these activities flees to the American consulate in Chengdu, which is a close by city, and tries to get asylum in the American consulate. So all of this is very disturbing, right? Like the fact that Xi couldn't control his party fiefdom is very disturbing. But even more disturbing is the way that he actually became sort of a popular figure in a way that the bland party leadership never did in the Hu Jintao era.
Disturbing, just to be clear, to the CCP, to the party.
To the party
right?
leadership, yeah.
Yeah, something is wrong here. As opposed to the U.S. response, which is like, we're just going to give Wall Street 0 interest rates so every business could purchase every other business.
We're going to bail them out so they can give themselves big bonuses and, have
I think that, but it's a funny contrast, but I think it's important. Like we're always talking about how, the United States is democratic, and so there's accountability, and China is undemocratic, and there's no accountability. And that's not quite right. It's more complicated than that. I certainly don't want to say that China is democratic. Like that's not true at all.
Just a hair off, yeah.
But the party leadership is responsive to popular unrest because it is absolutely obsessed with stability. So in a way that the American system tolerates a lot of instability, it's like, well, this is fine. People are like marching in the street. That's fine. We don't care about that. When they do that in China, the party leadership gets really scared. And they're like, we got to do something about this. And what they usually end up doing is they will arrest the leadership of that protest and put them in jail or put them in a mental asylum or something. But then they will concede the demands. They'll be like, yeah, the local cadre was corrupt. Like, he's gone now. So that pattern repeated hundreds and thousands of times over, that has led to changes in the system. And it generated this determination on the part of the incoming Xi Jinping leadership to we have to do something different. We have to crack down on corruption. So at kind of a large scale level, he did the same thing. He both cracked down on corruption in the party, and he cracked down on activism, like leftist or liberal activism for workers' rights, for like feminist movements, for like lawyers who were trying to represent people who had been abused, and investigative journalists. Like all of this stuff is really, really harshly repressed. But at the same time, he unveils this gigantic anti-corruption campaign that strikes the fear of God into the entire party apparatus. Like they had been very comfortable doing business in very corrupt ways, and all of a sudden that was an existential risk if they continued in that direction.
So this feels like similar to I think what happened here after the financial crisis. A bit of misdirection, right? Like you point the finger, you point the focus at corruption. This is all caused by, the bankers doing, nefarious misdeeds, or government, getting in bed with bad actors. And that's what caused this, rather than looking at anything structural within the system, because you don't want people to focus their anger on structural problems within the system. You want them to focus on the ephemeral corruption that you can deal with. The difference being that she actually did something about corruption, and we only talked about doing something about corruption. Yeah. We just, kind of said, oh yeah, there's corruption. Anyway, let's give these guys 0 interest loans and let them play with the money however they want. Like that, right. That's the big difference. But it's still, in both cases, seems like a misdirection. You're pointing the public outrage in a direction that's more manageable than if people actually started to focus on the problems within the system.
Yes. Yeah. And that's reflected in the fact that for all of the really sweeping changes Xi Jinping has introduced in the party and into the economy and into governance, it hasn't changed the basic inequalities and insecurities in Chinese society. So there have been many gestures towards like taking down rich people a notch, and towards strengthening like social safety net systems. And some of that is meaningful, but it really hasn't changed the class hierarchy. It hasn't changed the sense of insecurity. And as growth has slowed down in the economy, that has also intensified competition. And one of the things that the party is struggling with now is people are just like, it's not worth it. Like I'm not going to get anywhere. Like I can work. There's this term 996, which is jobs that require you to work from 9 in the morning to 9 at night, 6 days a week. And in like the tech industry, so that would actually be a standard issue in the sweatshops of an earlier era. Many of those are now being automated away. But this is now standard in very well paid tech industries, and all of these high profile tech companies. That's the requirement. And a lot of well educated young Chinese people, they take a job in these things and they're like, wow, this is awful. Like, I hate this. I'm not going to get anything out of it. Ultimately, it's not worth it. So there's a catchphrase in Chinese, "Tang Ping." It means like lying flat. And this has become, in the consideration of the party, this has become a social problem where people are like, I just give up. I don't care. I'm not going to work hard anymore. Like, this is stupid. I'm not getting anything out of it. And that's become so widespread now that the party is like, oh, we got to do something about this. So most recently, they're like, it's the foreigners are coming here and trying to brainwash our people into lying flat. It's like, no, that's not what's going on, guys.
Let's return to the story of the post-2009 period, because I think this is also crucial for understanding how Americans transformed their approach to China. But Xi actually does do two things that are pretty big. First, there's a large-scale industrial policy. And then second, which is basically a stimulus, and this results in the famous Made in China 2025 plan that's released in 2015. And then there's this infrastructure and residential building boom, which is the famous statistic you always hear, which is that China used more concrete in the first 2 years of the 2010s than the US used for the entire 20th century. So there are these things that happen. So what does he do? And then how does the US respond to these two moves?
Yeah, so I think it's really important. I think often the image we get in the United States is just like, China is the way it is, and it's always been like this. And that's not the case. China was really an export-oriented, manufacturing-driven economy from the already back in the 80s, but really accelerating in the after the WTO session, 2001. So in those years leading up to the financial crisis, Chinese growth was coming from massively expanding exports. And that is no longer possible after the financial crisis, because consumer demand really dries up in the rich countries. The rich countries are the only source of large-scale consumer demand in the global economy. So China has to find a new path to economic growth. And what it settles on in the short term is not intentional by any means, and something they're very anxious about, which is this gigantic property bubble. So that, combined with massive state-invested infrastructure build-out, is the driver of growth in the Chinese economy across the 2010s. And that's something that the leadership is constantly anxious that this is going to lead to a financial crisis, just like it did in the United States. And they're constantly trying to bring the property bubble down. And then every time they try to do that, the economy threatens to fall apart. So then they build it back up. So there's that. But the immediate recovery, which eventually spins off the property bubble, is from a gigantic stimulus that the government undertakes. And some of this is direct spending, and some of it is kind of encouraging the state-owned banking system to throw money everywhere. So the only country in the world that responded to the recession with a stimulus that was actually adequate to bring the economy back to growth was China. But unfortunately, because the structure of the economy isn't changed in a deep way, that leads to the creation of the speculative bubble. But at the same time, and this is in contrast to the smaller stimuluses that you see elsewhere, the party leadership also takes this as an opportunity to begin to move in a new direction that really is industrial policy proper. So up until this point, China was really, it involved state intervention in the economy, but these were relatively small scale interventions, or they were interventions that were across the board, which is not industrial planning proper. And Barry Naughton has very, very good recent work on this for those who want to follow up on these arguments. What happened after 2008 is that some programs that had looked to develop cutting edge technology sectors that were very nascent at this point, had really only gotten started in 2006. Those programs were suddenly flooded with money. So all of a sudden, there's a ton of money available to do something that was new for the Chinese state, which is trying to develop very rapidly sectors that previously had been completely dominated by the rich countries, including the United States. And those programs were quite successful. So very quickly then, Chinese companies are moving into sectors that previously the United States had counted on to not only to maintain its domination of those sectors, but also as ways to export into the Chinese market. Suddenly we have homegrown Chinese competitors, which means that the Chinese market is more competitive for American exporters. And some of that is stuff like construction machinery, like Caterpillar is a good example, a U.S. company that had made huge amounts of money exporting construction equipment and eventually producing it in China. All of a sudden, there are Chinese companies that are competing with that. And so the export markets become less compelling. The ways in which the Chinese state had always managed foreign investment to try to wring some benefits out of it for China, that becomes less tolerable because the money to be made in China is much smaller from the standpoint of foreign companies. And at the same time, China starts to compete in advanced sectors that the United States had kind of assumed would always belong to the United States and its allies. And you get things like Huawei, which is the only really successful multinational Chinese company, is not just successful, but it starts to become the most important telecommunications infrastructure company in the world. And it starts exporting and building the systems for countries around the world, including U.S. allies like the UK. So all of this is very scary because not just because of the ways that it challenges U.S. power and imposes greater competition on U.S. companies, but also because the United States itself is stagnant and struggling and facing a crisis of self-confidence. Like, we used to run the world. We were standing here at the end of history. It was us on top. The end of history was us on top. And all of a sudden, people are like, no, that sucked. Like, after the financial crisis, no, that utopia of free markets, free minds and free markets, that was a bunch of bullshit. We don't believe in that anymore. It's not working. It's not actually producing growth. It's not producing increased trade or international investment. And the American people are becoming increasingly restive. And eventually you get the Trump or Bernie political response to that. But even before it became clear that this was a political crisis for the mainstream political elite in the United States, it was clear that things were not working right. So there was a sense that things have gone off the rails. We don't know what's happening. Here comes China. They're like zooming up to catch up with us. What's going on?
Yeah, and there's a lot here. So you get these quote unquote populist responses in the United States, which I think are fair enough to call populist. Trump gets elected. No one expects that, particularly within the Republican Party. So he's not able to call on traditional Republican hands, which leads friend of the pod, Peter Navarro, to enter the scene. Can we talk about what you call the first rupture in Trump and how this rupture comes to be?
So there's all these anxieties around China in the American political elite broadly. And another thing to mention here is that as part of the process of export-led growth, China had accumulated huge U.S. currency reserves. And so in terms of the national debt, a lot of the U.S. national debt was owed to China. And that was another sort of source of anxiety, like, oh my God, we have to come hand in hand to China if we get in trouble. And Obama's first visit to China in 2009 was portrayed in the media as him like going to Beijing to kowtow to be like, help me out here, I'm in trouble. So you have all of these anxieties building up around China. And then you get specific in the national security state, you get specific concerns so one thing is the way that Huawei, if it builds the infrastructure of telecommunications, then suddenly China is going to, at least this was the fear, China is going to be able to surveil us the way that we have been surveilling everybody else. So we're going to, like, it's not, they've never actually offered any evidence that this was actually happening. But the fear is we used to dominate these telecommunications pipes and could use them however we wanted. And now we're going to lose that power, and maybe China's going to gain that power over us. So Huawei became a point of real anxiety for people in the national security state. And then you have some very aggressive moves from China in the South China Sea in this period too. And this involved, and this is very complicated and annoying to get into.
As most things are, complicated and annoying. That's what she said, Jake. That's what she said.
but there are these little like land features, right? They're too small to actually be called islands, but there are these little land features in the South China Sea that are contested between different countries. And you can strengthen your claim if you build up these features and turn them into something like an island, even if it's only like the size of an airplane field or something. And there was a process for asserting these claims. And so China is in contention with the Philippines, with Vietnam, also Taiwan. Taiwan also makes these claims because it still claims to be the government of China officially. And so there are these different claims in the South China Sea, and there was this process for asserting these claims, and that kind of spun out of control, where these different countries were all trying to build up their features, and China was much more able to do this than the other countries. And so China started moving very aggressively because China claims basically the entirety of the South China Sea, which goes all the way down, all the way south to Indonesia. It became very assertive in making these claims and pushing back against other countries, especially Philippines and Vietnam, that were also claiming areas in there. And so this was very disturbing to Americans in the national security state, because this is theoretically, this is international open waters, and a huge share of the world's commerce flows through there. And a key claim until recently of the United States as to why it should have a hegemonic position in the global order is that it would maintain the freedom of navigation. And so the fact that China looked like it might be moving to close off and take over this entire sea, that, kind of the way that the United States took over the Caribbean in an earlier period, that was very troubling to Americans in the national security state too. So there are a range of different specific tensions that are building up a lot of fear in the American foreign policy world, and then Trump comes in. But I think the way that this narrative has been told is China was becoming a more and more malign actor, or China was always a malign actor, but it was becoming more and more evident. And then Trump came in and he went after China with the trade war, and that allowed us, like the foreign policy world, to see the truth, which is that China is an enemy of the whole system. And it's quite a bit more complicated than that, because it is true that despite all of the frictions between the U.S. and China during the Obama years, this was also the height of U.S.-China cooperation. So there was a lot of cooperation around climate issues, like developing climate technologies, collaborations between the U.S. and China through a series of bodies that were set up. Of course, the Paris Climate Agreement ultimately came out of an agreement between the U.S. and China. There were cooperation around public health in Africa. They fought the Ebola outbreak in Central Africa in 2015, I want to say, together. There's a lot, and they set up a really massive system of diplomatic dialogues that connected bureaucrats on both sides, and they were constantly talking through a range of issues. And some of that was very frustrating, but they also had real outcomes from that, including an agreement to stop stealing commercial secrets through cyber theft on the Chinese side. So one complication is just that there actually was quite a bit of U.S.-China cooperation. Another complication to that narrative is that most of the foreign policy world continued to accept the basic idea that China is part of the system, and it's like a troublesome part of the system, and it needs to better integrate into the system. And there's all these reforms they should do, and they're not doing them fast enough. But there was very limited sense that China is outside the system or is an enemy to the system. That was really only extreme kind of right-wing hawks who had that view. So Trump comes in, and the first year of Trump doesn't actually change any of this. The the first national security advisor was Mike Flynn, but he left.
Right, and just basically because they don't expect to win, and so they don't have like national populists to basically turn to make China policy initially.
Well, they do. This is another I'm sorry to do a historian's thing about complicating things, but like
No,
Bannon was
it's
there,
fine.
Navarro was there. They were in the middle of this, and they were offering a framework for how we should confront China and turn China into a great like civilizational enemy, and that would be the basis on which we could mobilize our people and take down our own elites. That whole story was already developed, but these people were also completely on the outside of mainstream foreign policy thinking. And the people that Trump hired to be national security advisor, to be Secretary of State, these people were coming out of that mainstream foreign policy world, even though they were on the right edge of it. So H.R. McMaster, who came out of the military, he was very
Hello, history PhD.
very hawkish on Iran and North Korea and the Taliban, and he, through a lot of arm twisting, he convinced Trump to really ratchet up pressure on all of these countries. And the maximum pressure campaign that we all know and love was applied to all of these traditional enemies. Like, these are the enemies that are outside the system. These are the countries and the rogue states and the terrorists. That was the traditional target for American military violence. And the first year of the Trump administration just confirmed that. It didn't figure China as one of those actors. It figured China as someone that we could turn to help on this, particularly on North Korea. And they got some help from China on this. So if you have the misfortune of reading McMaster's memoir, you will find that China is barely present in the whole thing. And he was only there for a year, so it doesn't go all the way through. But in that first year, McMaster and Tillerson and Jim Mattis, the Defense Department, all of these people, none of them saw China as some enemy that we needed to mobilize the entire bureaucracy against. Even though you had Navarro and Bannon, who were there and were saying, "No, we need to do this," they were completely on the outside.
Okay, Jake. So we have the populists, we have Bannon, we have Navarro, but versus the roughly establishmentarians like McMaster. How does it come to be that Navarro in particular begins to exert significant influence in the latter parts of Trump 1?
Yeah, so it's not Navarro. It's he's kind of there as a foundation stone. He's there in the White House. He gets more and more power. But he's really complemented by this other guy in the National Security Council, Matt Pottinger. And Matt Pottinger is one of the few people who stayed the full 4 years across the administration until January 6th. And he was the one who came in basically with the solution to the problem that develops. So the problem that develops in 2018 is that the system of containment around Trump's chaotic impulses to rip apart the foreign policy establishment's whole system, that system of containment fell apart in early 2018. There were some personnel changes in the White House, and that meant the system that had prevented the nationalists from getting proposals through to Trump that he would just look at and be like, "Yeah, let's do it." The establishment people around him were like, "Well, if you do that, it's going to destroy our alliance system. If you do that, it's going to destroy the global economy." And so the foreign policy establishment people, as well as Gary Cohn, the chair of the National Economic Council, they had sort of like isolated Trump around their priorities, and that system fell apart. And suddenly, so Bannon is already gone. He got fired much earlier, but Navarro is there, and then Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, has also come in. And he's somewhat aligned. He's not kind of that extreme nationalism that Navarro is, but Lighthizer is certainly supportive of a confrontational approach to China on trade, and that very much aligns with Trump's own instincts. So that means that almost immediately in 2018, the trade war with China gets rolling. But it's not just trade war with China; it's trade war with everyone else too, because there are these steel and aluminum tariffs primarily targeting allies that are also put through. Even before the China tariffs get applied, and so this leads to kind of a broad-based alarm in the foreign policy establishment. So in the administration, but also Washington more broadly, and you can see this in Jake Sullivan, who would go on to be Biden's national security advisor, he writes an essay in 2017 where he's like, guys, don't worry about it. The system is holding. Like, Trump is not tearing anything down. It's going to be fine. And you see what he's writing by 2018. He's like, uh-oh, things are looking bad. We're going to have to do something about this. So the challenge is coming from Trump, who's attacking alliances, who's attacking the free trade system, who is ripping up the ideological claims about why American leadership is right and proper. Because he says crazy things like, we kill people too. Like, he has this sort of moral equivalence. He doesn't really buy the story of the shining city on the hill. So you have kind of a crisis at the level of the state, but then at the same time, you have these growing populist currents. So of course, there's the populist challenge within the Democratic Party represented by Bernie, but you also have the Charlottesville fascist rally with the tiki torches and Jews will not replace us slogan. You have kind of these shootings at synagogues, the shooting at the Walmart that targeted Latinos specifically on the theory of great replacement. All of these kinds of right wing, fascist adjacent ideology seem to be everywhere, and you have kind of a kind of partisanship that's running out of control. It's like our politics is lost. We can't have these agreements across the aisle anymore. The good old days when the political mainstream of the left and the right, we sat down and worked out our differences and we marginalized the extremes on both sides. Like, that sense of containment had also broken down. So there is a sense of like things are just running out of control now. We're losing our grasp on the American political system. It's like the mainstream political formation, its legitimacy and its power is slipping away. And at the same time, Trump is in danger of destabilizing the entire American system, where American hegemony is not just America as the most powerful country. It's that America administers a world-spanning system. And that system, the globalization system or the alliance system, it shows up in different ways, but these ways coordinate with each other. That system expresses American power and also bolsters it and makes sure that everyone who counts is on the inside and is by having given their consent to the system, they make it stronger and they make it harder to defy American power. And that does mean that the United States has to engage in give and take negotiations sometimes. And it does mean that the United States has to go off and bomb some countries, even though some of our allies don't agree with that. But of course, we stand taller, we see further. We have this responsibility for managing the system. Sometimes we're going to have to go off on our own, but basically our power is expressed through this system. And the thing that Trump threatened to do was to destroy this entire system. So this is a crisis for the foreign policy establishment. And ultimately, what I'm arguing is that the solution to this crisis was basically to take the things that Matt Pottinger and Peter Navarro were saying and turn that into a reconceptualization of what China is and what it does. And that reconceptualization is to take that earlier idea that China is like a troublesome part of the system, but it's a part of the system. We're trying to integrate it, and we can work with it together on system aims to basically throw that out and say, no, China is not part of the system. It is alien to the system. That the sort of national essence of China is that it is incompatible with the system because the system is freedom and China is tyranny, because the system is free markets and China is state intervention, because the system is American power and China rejects American power. So China is, by essence, is the opposite of the system, and it wants to overthrow the system. And there's basically nothing that happened in 2018. Like, there were these earlier tensions that were building up and these early anxieties about Chinese power, but nothing happens in 2018 that would cause a whole-scale reevaluation of China along these lines coming from China. But what does happen is that the United States, the foreign policy establishment in the United States, enters a sense of crisis, that they're losing control of the whole situation. And I don't want to say that it's happening at this level of intentionality for most people, but I think the way they found themselves to a resolution was to say, well, Trump really has all of this aggression towards China. Maybe we could work with that. Like, we're feeling anxious about China too. Maybe we could channel that aggression and draw on the threads that are on offer from people like Pottinger and Navarro, and turn that into a way to run foreign policy that preserves the system. You need to rip it apart.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem, just from my own historical work, is that the Cold War and the equation, particularly of Stalin with Hitler and then the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, in the imaginary of the United States, provides a justifying logic for American hegemony. And I would argue that from 1989 forward, you could narrate the history of U.S. foreign policy as being a search for a logic for itself. You see it in the 1990s with the responsibility to protect in the Balkans. You see it obviously 2001 as a godsend to the foreign policy establishment because it provides jihadist Islamic terror as a justifying logic. Once that is very clearly not an existential threat, the 2010, again, from a particular perspective, could be narrated as the search for an enemy that will allow the United States' establishment and global military posture and economic posture and cultural posture to continue as it has been since the middle of the 1940s. And so it's not a surprise that at some point they were going to land on China, which was clear that materially Russia just isn't what it used to be. China materially is, I would argue, way more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was. The more we learn that is going to be the case. So this makes total sense that in this moment of a crisis of hegemony, both in the literal sense of world hegemony, and then also the Gramscian hegemony that we've been referring to here about this sort of like voluntary buy-in to U.S. global power. Once that crisis happens, you're going to need a new logic, and you're going to really need a new enemy, which also plays into larger themes about the Manichaean structure of American thought. You know, give me liberty or give me death. Either you're with us or you're against us. You're with us or you're with terrorists, as George W. Bush said, or you're better dead than red. So there's this almost dualistic framework that I think is almost linked to like the Protestant origins of this country, with like a Calvinist, you are the selector, you are not the select. So this also plays into like deep substrates in American politics that really define what this country is. And it all comes to a head in 2018. So China, almost overnight transforms into a part of the system, into something that is outside the system that is fundamentally illegitimate.
Right. Yeah. And at some level, this is a very easy operation, like conceptually, because they already have that available. Like, this is what Iran is. This is what North Korea is. This is what Iraq used to be before we, went to it. And all we have to do is say, oh, now we understand. This is what China is too. And that sort of shifts China from the economic column. Like, there's a division of labor in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. There's one part that works on economic issues. There's one part that works on military issues. These two sides don't talk to each other very often, although it's starting to connect together now under pressure of the breakdown of neoliberalism. But each one has its own responsibility, right? And the military focuses on the rogue states and terrorists and that whole world. And the economy is more on the operations of the system, is more on perfecting, like more free trade agreements, more integration, more harmonization of standards, like more liberalization of everybody's the way that they manage their states, and that's where China was. And all you have to do is shift China from the economic side into the military side. And so at that level, conceptually, it's very easy. But then once you stop and think about what you're doing, and I'm not sure that they did that very much, but once you stop and think about taking the world's largest country, economically the second largest country, and the most important country for world manufacturing, the most important country for trade. Once you think about the ways in which China has potential for geopolitical power, it hasn't yet done this fully, but it could transform that economic power into military power. All of these things make that project of redefining China into something that would require that we change our entire foreign policy, not just our entire foreign policy, but our entire society.
So, Jake, with this transformation, how does Trump finish up his first term?
Yeah, so Trump is sort of carrying on this trade war from across 2018, 2019. Eventually, the two sides get into negotiations about what a resolution of the trade war could look like. By the end of 2019, they end up finally on agreement. After multiple escalations, they end up on an agreement where basically China's going to buy a lot of stuff from the United States. And this is because Trump is primarily concerned about the trade deficit and he wants those numbers to look better. But a lot of other people in the administration are primarily worried about the ways that China is starting to challenge the United States at a deeper level, right? So China is advancing technologically. It has a system of industrial policy that subsidizes a range of companies that compete with each other, and you get kind of a survival of the fittest dynamic. On the other end of that, you get companies that are very adept at posing a competitive threat to American companies. There's the problem of China coercing technology transfer from companies that invest in the Chinese market. So all of these things are the things that the people like Lighthizer in the administration are really concerned about, and that Trump actually doesn't really care about at all. So one way of thinking about this is that Lighthizer is trying to get China to play by the rules of neoliberalism that if China had played by it, never would have developed. And China's not going to do that. So China's not going to give up its industrial policy. It's not going to give up the basic political economy of the country. So agreement on that was not possible. So those people probably would have pushed the confrontation even further, but that just wasn't a concern for Trump. He didn't care about that stuff. He just wants to get money out of people. He wants to get money out of people, and he wants to dominate them. And he felt like he was doing that with this trade deal. And the trade agreement finally was signed at the very beginning of 2020, just before the COVID pandemic kicked off. But before that, as part of that trade negotiation dynamic, there were these moments when the negotiations got stuck, and Trump thought the Chinese side is not negotiating in good faith. They're not giving up what they need to give up. And so to raise leverage, then he basically took the chain off of the national security people in his administration who wanted to confront China in a much deeper and more serious way. And so, for example, a big example here is that eventually the United States acted to destroy Huawei, and they came very close to doing so by targeting its key revenue streams. And so you can imagine what this looked like on the Chinese side. This is the only successful multinational Chinese company. China has been obsessed with being successful internationally for status reasons and for economic reasons for forever. And the United States said, okay, that's not legitimate. It's not legitimate for you to have a successful company. We're just going to destroy it now. On the U.S. side, this was kind of like, well, Huawei is a national security threat. We better take prudent action to prevent the emergence of a national security threat. On the Chinese side, this was a very clear signal. The United States will not tolerate you succeeding. It will not tolerate you succeeding in economic growth. It will not tolerate you succeeding technologically. It will not tolerate you succeeding in raising your status in the global system. So, like, there's a hierarchy in the global system. China was moving up. The United States is not going to tolerate that. And for Trump, it wasn't any of these things. It was just, I'm going to take something from China so that I can give it back when they give me something I want. But there were a range of these kinds of measures where Trump was like, okay, yeah, go at it. Like these things that people like Pottinger and sympathetic people in the administration have been developing, and that Trump actively prevented from rolling out because he wanted the negotiations to go well sometimes. Then he's like, okay, yeah, go ahead and do it. All right, so that is kind of the status at the very beginning of 2020. And already the foreign policy establishment has basically seen what has happened here and has taken the Pottinger approach, which is we treat China as an enemy of the system, and we don't try to start a war, but we do try to systematically constrict its power across the whole range, economically, technologically, militarily. The foreign policy establishment has basically seized on this and said, okay, this is something that Trump wants, so we can get Trump's buy-in on this. This is something that populists want because they hate foreigners and they think China's a civilizational threat. This is something we want because we were feeling increasingly threatened by China. And this is something that will reinforce the system instead of ripping the system apart. So they seize on this as the solution to the crisis of their own authority over foreign policy. And you get a complete transformation. So again, Jake Sullivan is a great example here. At the end of 2017, he was writing, so the national security strategy from the Trump administration came out in late 2017. And it included some language from Pottinger about China and Russia being great power competitors. And American strategy is no longer about counterterrorism. It's about countering our great power competitors. And this is totally in line, Danny, with what you're saying. Like, oops, we spent all this time like getting terrorists. That went pretty badly for us. Rather than thinking about why that happened, rather than thinking about what the problems with that would have been, let's just like jump over to this other one. So that was the language. But Jake Sullivan looked at that and he said, no, this is actually wrong. I don't agree with this. Russia is trying to challenge the system, but China is not. And we need to deal with them in different ways. So the Trump administration is wrong. We shouldn't, like, China is part of the system, and it's disruptive in some ways, and we need to negotiate it with and apply pressure here and there. But to put it as an enemy of the system, that's wrong. So that's that's Jake Sullivan, end of 2017. Jake Sullivan, by the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, he's saying China is the enemy of the system. We need to mobilize all of our foreign policy powers to systematically restrict its power. So that's like Jake Sullivan is sort of the true embodiment of the foreign policy establishment.
He's our lodestar on this show. He's our northern.
Yes.
He's our
American prestige. That's what it's all about.
How much of a revelation is this for China? How clarifying is the first Trump administration in terms of like getting through this kind of muddled? We'll compete sometimes, we'll cooperate sometimes. We don't really we haven't really defined the parameters of this relationship yet, to just like, okay, like the U.S. is never going to just even grudgingly allow us to be on that level. They're going to do everything they can to prevent that from happening. And let's, maybe respond accordingly. How much of that, is there do we see a shift from Beijing because of that, kind of clarification?
Yes, no question. I mean, the kind of roots of that were already there. There was always a distrust of the United States, going back to the Cold War. And even when the U.S. and China were de facto allies in the 80s against the Soviet Union, and were sharing intelligence and technology and stuff, even then, the Communist Party leadership is like, but we know we can't trust them. Ultimately, they're going to try to overthrow us, if not directly, then through so-called peaceful evolution. And once the Soviet Union fell, and once Russia was absolutely destroyed by liberalization in the 1990s, then the party leadership looked at that and was like, this is what the United States wants. Ultimately, this is what the United States wants for us. And then, of course, that's what Clinton said. Like, you read that speech, that's what Clinton wants. And if you look at the way that even after the 90s, people talked about the liberalization in Russia, they were like, well, it would have been okay if we didn't have autocrats like Putin come in. And it's like, never mind that this was the worst deterioration in living standards in peacetime in like human history. So the Chinese leadership always distrusted the United States and always thought like that they don't have our best interests at heart. They're like intervening. They're, all the color revolutions around the world. Ultimately, they would do that to us if they could. So we better make sure that they can't. And some of that drives, China always really insists on being economically independent. It insists on not getting deeply indebted to foreign creditors so that it can't be at the mercy of the IMF and like U.S. bailout programs. And some of that is just like, well, we're not going to be able to develop effectively if we get stuck on the other end of structural adjustment. But some of that is also geopolitical. It's like if the United States has this leverage over us, then they can dominate us. So yeah, that was always there. But there was also, a very clear sense, like the United States is like, it did bring us into the WTO. Like it imposed some pretty tough terms on us, much tougher than any other country entering the WTO up to that point. But nonetheless, it did bring us in. It did offer us these opportunities. It has, there's alongside the rhetoric about, liberalization leading to democracy, there's also this rhetoric about we're not trying to make China our enemy. We want China to be on the inside, not on the outside. So it was there was an ambivalence there in the leadership. And then after the 2018, 2019 episode, and particularly after 2020, it's important to emphasize that this change in the foreign policy establishment's thinking about China had been completed by the end of 2019. But what happens with the Trump administration under pressures of the COVID pandemic and the mishandling of that pandemic by the Trump administration is Trump just turns 100% to scapegoating China for everything. And that means that dynamic of unleashing the national security hawks in the administration during the negotiations is just ramped up 100-fold. And you get, so by this point, Pompeo is Secretary of State, and the people around him, and Matt Pottinger is more influential and is able to unfold a lot of the ideas that he had been developing. So the real China hawks, the people who are committed to kneecapping China and restricting China, and those people are off the leash entirely in 2020, and that is actually very. I think we put ourselves in a very scary situation that is little realized. After Trump loses the election, China became convinced that Trump was about to start a war with China because in order to distract from his loss of the election. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had to call China and say, we're not starting a war. So we could have very easily gotten into China becomes convinced that the U.S. is going to attack us, and they move first, and then we actually could have had a war in the Pacific at the end of 2020. So after that point, then I think China is pretty well convinced that the United States, there's not really any ambivalence, although they are kind of waiting to see how the Biden administration will run things to see if that's true across both parties.
Jake, as we just talked about, with talking about the Biden administration, where U.S.-China relations stood when Biden came in, and really the people who Biden surrounded himself with and what their approach to the world and China had been. We talked a little bit about Jake Sullivan, but feel free to start wherever you think it makes the most sense.
I mean, that's a good place to start because he was really the one who led administration foreign policy thinking. He was really the one who was at the top of the hierarchy, particularly on China policy. As soon as Sullivan came in, he reorganized the bureaucracy to concentrate everything in the National Security Council. So he was the head of the National Security Council, and on the NSC, he had a bunch of his friends who were vocal anti-China figures in the couple years leading up to Biden coming into office. And so Kurt Campbell, who was the Indo-Pacific coordinator on the NSC, his China directors, Laura Rosenberger, Russ Doshi, Julian Gewirtz, all of these people had been coming up with ways to systematize what Trump had been doing. So Trump was going after China. In his own mind, he was trying to build leverage, but many of the people who were actually developing the antagonistic policy were trying to systematically diminish China. But it was kind of a crazy and random assortment of policies that didn't fit together very well, that were sort of deployed and pulled back, that were deployed and didn't really work very well, and so they tried something different. And what the Biden people had been doing was observing this and thinking about how they could do it right. So we're going to systematically diminish China, but we're going to do it right. We're going to do it systematically, and really importantly, we're going to bring the allies in on it. If it's just the United States that's antagonistic to China, then China can go for technology or for diplomatic support or for whatever. It can go to these other allies that are a core part of the architecture of American power. So it's important sort of as an end in itself, because these are the right-thinking foreign policy establishment that thinks the allies are one of the most important features of the U.S. system. But it also had a real impetus in that this will make our restrictions on China actually do something. So Sullivan comes in. He has these people around him. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is on board for it too, even if he's not kind of in the middle of the policymaking. And another thing to understand is it's not just a foreign policy. It's from Jake Sullivan's perspective, and he came up through the kind of schooling of the foreign policy establishment, but he also served as a domestic policy advisor for Hillary Clinton on her 2016 campaign. And he saw the ways that failed politically. And he was determined to figure out a way to rehabilitate the American mainstream political establishment. So it's not just that he thought anti-China politics was good for sort of reviving the power of the American foreign policy establishment and making it coherent. He also thought that anti-China politics could be the basis for a political breakthrough in the paralyzed American political system, because you could get Democrats and Republicans on board. You could justify passing legislation, particularly industrial policy legislation, forms of state intervention in the economy, and even supporting workers' rights. You could justify that through anti-China politics in a way that you couldn't if you were just saying, well, this would be good for people. And so the idea was, we're going to get Republicans on board for this. We're going to get Democrats on board for this. Everyone's going to be bought into a new vision of how to run the economy. The new vision of how to run the economy is going to revive the legitimacy of the political mainstream. And the new domestic social cohesion that comes out of this project is going to allow us to effectively subordinate China forever.
I think it's important to stress this, because the Biden to me marks the real break. Like, Trump is the one who turns this relationship very antagonistic, but you could treat that presidency as an aberration if the Biden people had come in and said, no, let's go back to where we were, 8 years ago, talking about engagement. But really, the Biden administration is where the break becomes bipartisan. It becomes like accepted across the spectrum in DC that this is an antagonistic relationship now. And as I know you've written about this, it has a lot to do with sort of the breakdown of the neoliberal consensus, basically, which was the thing that kept the U.S. and China more or less, if not cooperative, more or less operating under the same sort of basic assumptions and rules. So can you talk a little bit about that breakdown and about what it means for the Biden administration to have accepted basically the Trump China policy almost whole cloth, with the proviso that, like, we're going to do it better than Trump did?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I would add to that is that what Trump thought he was doing with his policy is something different than what his broader administration thought they were doing. And it was really the Matt Pottinger foreign policy establishment synthesis of this, that what we're doing is we're trying to reshape the American system by kicking China out of it. And that, once we kick China out, that will kind of rig the system in favor of the United States, and we'll be able to reconstitute our power. That was the project of the foreign policy establishment, that it landed on that as the resolution to the crisis of populism and the crisis of American decline by 2019. Trump's project was totally different. And we've seen that now over the last year plus, and as he returns from Beijing. So it was that the foreign policy establishment version of anti-China politics, which was systematic and meant to permanently subordinate China, that the Biden administration took up and rationalized and made it much, much more effective and more threatening to China. And you're right, that signaled to China very clearly that there is no possibility in the American system for a vision of the world in which China can succeed too. China had some hopes. I don't know how seriously they believed, but they had some hopes for the relationship under Biden. And the first interaction Biden didn't have a phone call with Xi Jinping for many, many weeks afterwards. Well, after he had a phone call with Putin and all kinds of other scoundrels. So he put off even just the phone call, and that's this less symbolic repudiation of China. And then they finally set up a meeting between the top two foreign policy figures on both sides. So this is Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan on the U.S. side, and the meeting was in Anchorage, Alaska, which is sort of like halfway in between, but it's like on American soil. And so they come to the meeting. Before they came to the meeting, they went and visited, top American officials went and visited Asian allies to make it clear, and they also put some sanctions on China to make it clear that this was not a friendly meeting. They go into the meeting and they basically shout at each other in public for the better part of an hour about how you're screwing up the world. No, you're screwing up the world. And so this was that was the signal. This relationship is now permanently confrontational. That's a signal that's the conclusion that the Chinese side took anyway. And then from that point, the impetus on the Biden side was to say, we're going to rebuild our power. Like Trump dissipated our power, destroyed our reliability with the allies, made a mess of the state. We're going to rebuild that power. And then once we've rebuilt that power, we're going to come to China and negotiate from a position of strength. And this was really, really galling to the Chinese side. They're like, you're going to come and dictate to us, is what you're saying. Which it was what they were saying. And part of the reconstitution of that power was not just renewing the alliances and not just like convincing NATO to put China all over the public NATO statement coming out of the big meeting of at NATO headquarters. Much more threatening it was that the Biden administration rolled out a comprehensive blockade on advanced semiconductors, not just that China couldn't buy them, but that anyone with any U.S. person, so that includes like corporations, corporations are people too, my friend. So that includes like corporations.
Oh, we agree.
That includes corporations and like people with citizenship. Like, so any U.S. person was barred from working on producing the technology that would allow China to produce these semiconductors. So it was a ban on the semiconductors and also a ban on the means of making the semiconductors. That's what it was meant to accomplish. And that was just the kind of first movement on the technology front. And then the Biden administration kept, and this was an explicit directive from the National Security Council when it came in. It said, keep everything that Trump was doing. And then down the road, they were considering whether to change any of the tariffs or, make them like smarter or whatever. And ultimately, or even something as like Trump had shut down the Fulbright program, the educational exchange program that would allow American scholars to go to China and fund them to do research. That's something that Trump had shut down in a fit of pique in the middle of COVID. And Biden could have restarted at any time. And maybe even if you hated China, it would be a good idea to know something about China, like theoretically. But they didn't even restart that. So it really was, they kept everything that Trump had done, but they tried to systematize it and make it much more effective, which had a predictably threatening outcome on the Chinese side.
So a couple of questions. One, I think that they were trying to rerun the Cold War playbook or the early Cold War playbook, which is that you would justify social democratic investment in the domestic economy through reference to threats to security. The one that I always quote to my students is, of course, after Sputnik, the National Defense and Education Act, which really funds area studies and STEM and all of those good things. But we didn't really get that whatsoever. So I was just curious, what were the differences in obviously very different moment, the late 50s into the 60s and the early 2020s, but why do you think we actually didn't get that reinvestment in social democracy in the United States with reference to China? To me, it's a big question. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question because I think they more or less were genuine. Like they understood, it's maybe not genuine in the sense that they cared about people's lives, but they genuinely understood that they had been damaged by the fallout from neoliberalism. And Jake Sullivan and some of his collaborators used the word neoliberalism specifically. So they had the sense that just the incessant liberalization and power market forces and massive inequality and people's everyday insecurity, that these things had really damaged popular support for mainstream politics. And that was what was producing extremism, extremism of left and right. And I think that, that diagnosis, I think, is basically right. The question is what they were going to do with that. And I think they genuinely thought that anti-China politics would get them to a breakthrough along the lines that you're talking about. Maybe not as ambitious as in post-war, like social democracy or what passed for it in the United States. But that's what they were aiming for. And I think the big difference is simply that the predecessor or the precondition for post-war social democracy was a breakthrough for the power of labor in the Depression. And it was the ability of the labor movement in the United States to establish genuine power that was subsequently restricted in various ways, but it was never dismantled, or at least until the late 70s. There was a real foundation of social power on which social democracy could stand. And that was important not just for the politics, it was important for the economics too, because the labor breakthrough of the 30s meant that workers would be earning enough money in the 50s that they could buy the stuff that the economy was producing. And since we had no labor breakthrough, there was not nearly the sort of political support for what the Biden administration was looking for that we had in the 50s. And there also was not the kind of economic dynamics that where the economy would produce stuff that like people whose wages were systematically being increased because they had union representation, or because they lived in markets dominated by rising wages, and companies had to compete for that. The economy of the Biden period was basically the neoliberal economy of 10 years prior. And I don't think they understood that was a problem, but I don't think they appreciated how deep that problem was. And they thought they could just do it through some anti-China politics that would get unions on our side. And once we get a stable political majority, then we can put all in the right policies, right? It was a very technocratic group of people, rather than a politically oriented group, with the exception of a handful of people like Ron Klain, the chief of staff, very politically oriented. But the people on the foreign policy side, they were very technocratically oriented, like just got to get the right policies.
Yeah, very naive and in retrospect, kind of ridiculous. So the Biden comes in guns blazing, reflecting what happened, this transformation in the late 2010s. And then obviously the two big crises in terms of foreign policy, the Biden administration are Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and then the October 7th attack and Israel's response. So obviously we've talked a lot about both on those shows, on this show. But how is Biden relating to China during the administration, and particularly how is China reacting to these events?
Yeah, the intention was that they were going to focus on China. That was going to be the focus of foreign policy. And the meeting that Biden had with Putin in 2021 was meant to kind of lower the tensions with Russia and signal to Russia that, like, hey, we can be cool because we want to focus on China. In the press conference after that, Biden was asked about China, and he said, look, Putin understands. He doesn't want China dominating him either, right? So this was like obviously kind of a projection of his own feelings onto Putin. But the intention initially was, we're going to cool things down with Russia. We're going to focus on China. And, right before October 7th, 2023, because the semiconductor controls came out October 7th, 2022. So people in the China world had a different association with October 7th prior to 2023. But right before the Hamas attack on Israel, Jake Sullivan was confident the Middle East was under control. So they really, really wanted to focus on building up power in Asia, on restricting China economically, and getting all the allies on board. And these huge explosions just pulled all their attention, just as various crises in the Middle East and Europe had been pulling American attention away from Asia for well over a decade at that point. But I think that's something meaningful, right? Their formulation was, Russia is pretty bad, and this was after the Ukraine war started. Russia is pretty bad. Russia wants to disorder the entire world, but China is the only power that wants to do that and has the power to do it. And this is a formulation that they came out with in the speech that Blinken gave on China policy, and they stuck with it. So again, that articulates this new consensus in the foreign policy establishment that we have our system. It's the American system. China is alien to it, is hostile to it, and must be evicted from it. Otherwise, it will overthrow it. And the fact that we don't have crises coming out of Asia all the time kind of indicates otherwise, kind of indicates that the part of the world that is most stably integrated into that system is precisely Asia, not just China, but China very prominent among it. And the reason that American foreign policy attention keeps getting pulled back to these emergencies is that the real anti-system forces are much more powerful, not in Asia, not around China, China is basically a status quo power. It is the out of control right-wing nationalism in Russia, in Israel, and Hamas too. Hamas is also a version of reactionary nationalism, and Ukraine had its own reactionary nationalism. Like all of it's the sort of conflicts that come from an unhinged reactionary nationalism that have been leading to the explosions around the world. And ultimately, I think they come at a deep level from the same forces that are pushing the U.S. and China against each other. But the U.S. and China, at least up to Trump too, were basically status quo powers. And so even as the confrontational nature of the relationship developed, they still were able to keep things relatively cool.
So I do want to move to Trump too in a second, but maybe just a concluding question about Biden. How would you grade the Biden administration's approach? What was this a hinge point, or is this basically what the Democrats have been doing since 2001, which is they're institutionalizing the move that the Republican Party made? Obama institutionalizes the war on terror. Biden institutionalizes antagonism with China, and that's basically the big takeaway when we're looking at their global grand strategy.
I think that's certainly true, but then it kind of raises the question of why that makes sense for them. And so that's where I think you need this, excuse me, this explanation coming out of the way the foreign policy establishment grappled with the crisis of its own power and legitimacy to make sense of why they came on board for this. And like I think, yes, it's true that Obama institutionalized the war on terror, but he also wound down significant parts of it. There was no prospect of that. Biden only escalated on China. There was no, some of these things are destabilizing or, counterproductive or damaging, unnecessary and damaging people we don't need to be damaging. There was nothing like that. It was all just, we're going to find new ways. We're going to be producing systematically new ways of restricting China and countering China, everything. The U.S. government is really oriented, particularly in foreign policy, is oriented towards crisis points. And a lot of the energy goes into just everyday diplomatic maintenance and dealing with crises. The one thing, and I've heard this from someone who worked in the State Department, the one thing that people were told actually to proactively be doing was generating ideas for countering China. And this was true not just in the U.S.-China relationship, not just in Asia, but across all regions. It was like, take care of the crises in your region and generate ideas for countering China in your region.
So, Jake, I think it makes sense to move on to Trump too. And here we're going to get into, events that just happened in the last few days. Trump's summit with Xi Jinping in China. Maybe it makes sense to start with a little compare and contrast between the bombast with which Trump came back into office on China with, we're going to, impose 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. Like, we're going to shut down trade altogether, to what we just saw, which was Trump almost going hand in hand to Beijing, like asking the Chinese, asking Xi to just keep things on an even keel and not rock the boat, and please, don't hurt us anymore, essentially. Let's start with, coming in and really seemed like they were ready to go full on. Like, we're going to, we're going to extract these two economies from one another. We're going to pull them apart, no matter how painful that might be in the short term. But we're just going to make it impossible for China to do business in the United States and go from there. And how quickly that unraveled.
Yeah, that's not how I would read the motivations. I think for Trump, he went in, he wanted basically to humiliate everyone so that he could show them that he's in charge. And that was, that's true with Zelensky and the infamous meeting in the White House. It's true with Ramaphosa. It's true with Petro from Colombia. Like, he sort of like went down the line and just like humiliated different leaders. So he didn't do quite that with China, but immediately after coming in, he put on 2 rounds of tariffs, and they weren't crazy. They were 10% each, but they were supposedly about fentanyl. And China said, look, we're already working with you on, it's because China is responsible, like Chinese manufacturers produce a lot of the precursor chemicals for fentanyl that are shipped to Mexico. And then in Mexico, the drug businesses turn them into fentanyl and sell it in the US. So it's been a complaint on the US side, like, we need more help from you in controlling these precursor chemicals. And China has been sort of on the fence, like, well, this is like, these are chemicals that are used in lots of stuff, or, this or that like, you can't just, like, the US actually wants, like, FBI agents in China, like, basically doing the enforcement. And China's like, well, we have concerns about sovereignty, like, as the victim of imperialism, we don't want to go all the way with that. But
well, to be fair, like, as you said, these are chemicals that are used in industrial processes all over the place, and the fact that they're brought to Mexico and turned into fentanyl for shipment to the United States is a U.S. problem. There's a demand for fentanyl in the United States. We've gotten people hooked on this stuff. Like, it does. I can see from the Chinese perspective why, let us put FBI agents in you. You have to take care of this problem for us because of something that your companies are doing that isn't necessarily intended for the use that it's being put to, and is being put to that use because we've got a massive demand problem in the US, but you have to clean it up for us. Like, I can see the frustration there.
Well, that's one interpretation, but if you listen to congressional hearings, you might find out that what's actually going on is that China is sending fentanyl to America in order to kill Americans,
deliberately poisoning us. Yeah,
in revenge for the opium war.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what was I thinking?
but anyway, Trump put these tariffs. So U.S. and China had been working together on fentanyl already from the Biden administration, but China put these tariffs on, and the point of the tariffs was not to get more cooperation out of China, at least not for Trump. The point was to hit China in the face and say, look, I'm in charge now. And that's true. And we know that's true because China offered a range of ways to work together, and Trump just dismissed them out of hand. But so China didn't immediately react to those initial tariffs. It kind of, there was some slight retaliation, and then it also was like, but we're open to talking. And then it was the Liberation Day tariffs, which added another 35%, I think, on China. That they said, okay, that's it. We're just going to, it seems like you don't want to talk to us. We're just going to respond with our own 35%. And then Trump flipped out and he was like, China panicked. That's the one thing they should have never done. Like, you can't respond to the attacks that I make on you. And so he put on another 50% or whatever. And then China was like, okay, well, I guess we'll do another 50%. And then Trump was like, no, you can't do that. And so then he put another 50%. So we were up to, both sides were way over 100% tariffs on each other in the course of a week. And if that had been allowed to stand, then the economic relationship just would have been over overnight. So I think the way that I would read that is rather that Trump's own anger at being defied by someone that he had expected to dominate got the best of him, and he just let it get out of control. And I think, and we know that the Trump administration was very confident that if they put tariffs on China, that the Chinese economy would, like, basically fall apart. So China wasn't going to stand up to the U.S. in this way. So I think it also was just disorienting that China was like, no, we're going to do it. And they did it, and it was fine. And not only did they match the tariffs, but then they put controls on the export of rare earth elements that American manufacturing companies rely upon for magnets mainly. And that did start to shut down some production in the United States. So it was at that point that Trump was like, oh, okay. Actually, I'm gonna.
Yeah, oops.
And this is, you have to give Trump credit on this one. There are some people with an authoritarian personality who escalate things out of control, and then they're like, well, I can never back down because that would destroy my credibility. And Trump is like, I can back down at the drop of a hat. I don't care. So they went all the way back
yeah,
down.
I don't have any credibility. What the hell?
They took those tariffs all the way down to where they had started. So the fentanyl tariffs were still on, but the Liberation Day tariffs and the escalation out of that was brought all the way back down. And I think there probably was this moment. So there was a couple weeks there where things looked pretty dicey, and it looked like, yeah, maybe we are heading for the entire relationship blowing up. And that could, because of all these pressures everywhere, that could lead to these conflicts getting into the security realm as well pretty easily. if that's the direction Trump is going to take it. But I think people like Besant were there, and they understood that if that was the direction we were going to go, that would blow up the global economy. So even though there are a ton of China hawks in the Trump administration who would have been very happy to pocket this and be like, okay, yeah, we're done with China now, we're going to just fight them. I think that Trump himself never had that intention. And once he sort of got over the trauma of being confronted by someone who responded to what he wanted to do, then they were able to bring it down to and so then we had another couple of kind of like roller coaster rides on this across the course of the year. But where it ended was Trump and Xi Jinping met each other in Busan, South Korea at the end of October last year. And they said, okay, like China is going to pull back the rare earth controls. The United States is going to pull back there were a bunch of restrictions on Chinese companies that had come out. The United States is going to pull those back. We're going to keep the tariffs where they are, and we're going to start talking to each other about what we could do together. And there wasn't a whole lot of talking. Like, in preparation for this trip, there was very little preparation. But that's kind of where we have arrived at some kind of like basic level of stability.
Much like what happened when the U.S. and Israel went to war with Iran, and Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, which was the most foreseeable thing imaginable with that conflict. China imposing these rare earth controls seems like the easiest thing to predict. If you push hard enough, if you go to, if you lose control of you lose your mind and say, I'm outraged that they would match our tariffs, so we're going to go to 100% tariffs. Like, it's one of the easiest things you could imagine China responding with is restricting rare earths. And so I'm curious where this confidence that China would fold when they had that card to play comes from within the Trump administration. Like, where does this idea that all you have to do is impose some tariffs on Chinese products and the whole economy is going to collapse and they're going to be begging for scraps from the U.S., where does that come from?
Yeah, and it's not just the Trump administration. Like the Biden administration, by the middle of the Biden administration, the top China people in the Biden administration were convinced the Chinese economy was about to collapse, and they were like, "How should we prepare for the crisis that comes out of this, rather than how do we need to confront Chinese power?" They were well convinced that that's what was happening. And like the Chinese economy has some problems, sure, but it wasn't going to collapse. So I think it's hard to tell, and it may be different for different people. Like in Trump's case, I think he just feels like he's all powerful, particularly after the election. He felt like he was all powerful, can do anything. And he still obviously felt that way at least up until starting the war with Iran this year. But I think a lot of other people are just totally bought into this idea that like China's got a state-run economy. State-run economies can't work. So if they seem to be working, that's like an illusion. And all we have to really do is just push, and the whole thing will fall apart. And there's a buttress to that, which is the idea of global imbalances, where the Chinese economy depends very heavily on export for growth. It's not driven internally by rising consumption. Well, China actually has had much higher rates of consumption growth than any other major economy in the world. But compared to the growth in production, the consumption has really lagged behind. So the idea is, if you can't have that export market, consumption can't fill it in. And so if you withdraw the export market and just cut China off from the American market, then they will have no choice but to give in to us. And so I think there's kind of a vulgar version. There are more sophisticated versions of that are out there that I think miss a lot of important things, but do have things to teach us. There's a vulgar version of that's basically just like the only thing that's keeping the Chinese economy going is export. So if we don't let them export, then they're going to collapse. And I think that was widely believed in the Trump administration.
So, of course, the thing that's happened between October and this most recent meeting in Beijing is the full-out U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. and China had becoming slightly more involved in the Middle East, particularly with its brokering of that agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. And this is of direct interest to me because I'm trying to think through what the United States' future in the world is going to be. And my read on this, at least initially, is that China's going to be like, you guys want to be involved in the Middle East and sink everything into it? Go for it, but not totally. So how does China, what's going on in China relate to this?
So a big part of it is just China looks at the terrible mess that the United States has made of the Middle East and is like, well, we're not going to do that. We're not stupid. Like anything when China helps broker the Iran-Saudi normalization that you mentioned, people in Washington were like freaking out. They're like, oh my God, China's going to take over the Middle East. They're like, China doesn't want any part in the security conflicts of the Middle East. And this is broadly true. China has very self-consciously stayed out of the kinds of conflicts. And sometimes the United States complains about that. And they're like, China needs to pull its weight. China needs to come in and like line up with us and help us cut this or that country out of the global economy. And China's the lifeline. And in the past, that was just like, the Chinese, you can't count on them for anything. And more recently, that has turned into, the Chinese are maintaining an axis of aggressors or an axis of upheaval or an axis of this or that with all of the enemies of America, because the Chinese are trading with them more or less. They're not doing much of anything else with them, but they are trading with them. And so that must mean that they're in an alliance. And then when the United States attacked Venezuela at the beginning of this year and then attacked Iran and China didn't do anything, people are like, aha, China can't defend its alliance commitments. And it's like, you guys, there were no alliance commitments. China, because the interest that China has in the Middle East is only very far down on the list about geopolitics. It's much more about economic involvement. It's access to energy and the other things that we have now discovered come through the Strait of Hormuz, like fertilizer or whatever. It's trade with the countries that have thriving or used to have thriving economies, which was not Iran. Obviously, it's not. In fact, like, as a general proposition, the countries that the United States has destroyed through sanctions and stuff are not very appealing partners to China because they don't have very strong economies. So it was economies like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and Israel. Those were the places that China was interested in doing trade and investment. And if you look at the trade and investment figures, they're 10 times or more the number that you get with Iran. So like Saudi Arabia is an order of magnitude higher economic involvement of Chinese actors compared with Iran. So China does really have an interest in stability in the region, but that interest by no means drives them to assert militarily or put pressure on a crazy, unpredictable actor like the United States, right? It's the United States is sort of flailing around, hitting people in the face at the drop of a pin. And does China want to step into the middle of that? No. The number one priority for China is maintain stability in the relationship with the United States so that we can get on with what we're trying to do, which is pursue our economic interests with other places and pursue our growing influence in international institutions and gain the diplomatic goodwill of different countries. So it's, like, if China could snap its fingers and make things change in the Middle East, it might do it. But it's just too dangerous, and China's foreign policy has been very cautious almost across the board, the only exception being something like Taiwan or the South China Sea. And that's been true for decades.
So, Jake, to bring us up to the present day as we're recording this, it's the end of day 2. As we're recording this, it'll be out in a couple of days. But as we're recording, it's the end of day 2 of the 2-day Trump summit with Xi. There was a lot of talk about, what's going to come out of this. What kind of, are we going to get a trade deal? Are we going to get, some gesture toward helping Trump, reopen the Strait of Hormuz? Are we going to get something big on Taiwan? Like, what's going to happen here? And it feels almost anticlimactic. Like, there was really not anything major that seems to have happened here, which in itself could be considered a big deal in that, everything seems to be just sort of status quo, even keel. There was apparently like Xi kind of telling Trump or declaring to Trump that, Taiwan is the biggest potential flashpoint in the U.S.-China relationship, which isn't a new thing. I mean, I guess he stated it fairly frankly to Trump in their initial meeting, but it's not like that's a new message from the Chinese government. So it really feels like we just got not making any waves, nothing bad happened, but really there was no major development either way. As you were observing this, and I know you spent some time in China recently, kind of, prior to this summit, and got a sense of what the expectations were there. But what do you take away from what we saw, over the last couple of days?
Yeah, and you're right. The news media were really looking for something that they could grab a hold of and be like, aha, like somebody won or lost this, or like someone's up, someone's down. And they didn't really have much to work with, and all they really had to work with was the Taiwan thing. And again, you're right that this is just the same thing China says pretty much every time they meet with the United States. And what I heard when I was in Beijing talking with people in the foreign policy world there a couple weeks ago was contrary to a lot of speculation in U.S. foreign policy world, that Trump was getting ready to trade away Taiwan, or he was getting ready to change the declaratory formulation around what policy on Taiwan the U.S. supports, which doesn't amount to much of anything, but in the foreign policy establishment was considered an issue of crucial significance. We didn't hear anything like that. But what people told me in Beijing was, even if Trump did something like that, we don't trust him to keep his word. Even if he kept his word, we don't trust the politics in the United States to not lead to some sort of crazy backlash. So the point about Taiwan was primarily that at the last meeting between Trump and Xi at Busan, they didn't really bring up Taiwan. And then right after that, there was this record-breaking arms sale that the United States made to Taiwan. And China felt like that was embarrassing. And so they really wanted to make the point, like, you can't forget about Taiwan. You have to remember that Taiwan is the most important thing in the world. And because I think it is actually very easy for the United States not to appreciate how important this is to China. Well, like, what a core commitment to Chinese nationalism this is, how important it is to the legitimacy of the ruling class, how important it is just as a commitment of what leadership thinks its goals are. And it's only become more salient as nationalism has gotten stronger in China. And of course, American hostility to China has also exacerbated nationalism in China. And sort of it constantly activates this sense of being under siege from imperialist powers, which when the Biden administration was organizing the G7 countries against China, the G7 countries are almost the same countries that occupied Beijing in 1900. And looted some of the great imperial treasures in Beijing. So this is like the kind of block building that was going on under Biden is almost perfectly pitched to raise the nationalist hackles on the Chinese side, which makes the Taiwan issue really, really important at a popular level and at an elite level in China. And it's true that I think the United States doesn't take this very seriously. So I think the point of Xi Jinping emphasizing that was just like, take this seriously. And they were not trying to start a confrontation because they think basically the Taiwan issue is going in their direction. They think we had this great visit from the Kuomintang leader. We're going to open up lift these restrictions on connections with Taiwan that we had. It doesn't feel like the current president is kind of independence oriented, even if he would never formally proclaim that. Seems like he's on the back foot. So I think Chinese leadership feels like the Taiwan issue is going in the right direction. So they don't want to start a confrontation with the United States when they feel like things are moving in their direction. And then everything else, again, you're right. It doesn't seem like there was much progress. A range of issues were discussed ahead of the actual meetings around trade, Board of Investment, that would have helped facilitate Chinese investment into the United States. Of course, the Iran issue was discussed. Apparently, tariffs were not discussed at all. Trump claims the tariffs were not discussed at all. So I don't know. He's really losing his step here if he's not talking about tariffs. Like that's the single most important thing to him. Like his core value is tariffs. So I don't know what's going on there. But the takeaway for me is just that we're in this moment of stability, and that offers an opening to try to put the relationship on solid ground. But we're not on that solid ground, and you can tell that by the way that the U.S. foreign policy establishment was just raising all these alarms about Trump might do this, Trump might do that, how awful it would be if the U.S. and China had an agreement on something, like how dangerous it is to fall for their art. Like the Xi Jinping brought out a slogan about constructive and stable relations between U.S. and China. Sounds better in Chinese. And various foreign policy establishment types were like, don't say this, Trump, you can't say those words. You're falling into the Chinese trap. And it's like, okay. If the Chinese trap is to say something that seems nice, okay, terrible trap. Let's avoid that. Yeah. So that to me is ominous, is like the foreign policy establishment. There is kind of an opening. We've kind of stopped the crazy momentum towards conflict, but it's not changing in the foreign policy establishment. Democrats primarily were denouncing Trump for the idea that he might do something constructive with China. There were a range of bills and resolutions that were introduced to Congress saying like China is our great enemy and you must not ever do anything with China. So I think we're still on dangerous ground, even though Trump kind of stabilizing things and kind of throwing out the conventional wisdom. There is some kind of opening there. It's really hard to believe he's going to take advantage of that and actually, create a stable relationship.
Jake, I think that's a perfect place to end. I would like to have you back on to talk more about hegemonic transition. What does the party in China think it is actually doing? But I think this is a great episode on U.S.-China relations. But thank you so much for coming, and we'd love to have you back again soon.
Yeah, totally. Great conversation, guys. I appreciate it.